right, your mics are hot.
All right, now we're good.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're listening from. Welcome to RAP, or Revolutionary African Perspectives. You just heard Car Wash by Rose Royce. Today's date is May 4th, 2026, and the voice you're hearing right now is Steven, and joining me this week are my co-hosts, Dan, with our good sister.
What's good?
With our good sister Abayomi on the board. This episode of Revolutionary African Perspectives will discuss ICE terror in Georgia, Spirit Airlines going out of business, new sanctions on Cuba, and class warfare in Atlanta. If you enjoy listening to us here on Revolutionary African Perspectives, we appreciate you joining us and not turning that dial. You can find and listen to previous episodes of RAP online at www.wrfg.org/rap. The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of WRFG's board of directors, staff, or volunteers, but they do represent we revolutionary African. I was about to say we revolutionary African perspectives. We are not a perspective. We are people. How are you doing today?
How am I doing? That's a good question. I'm doing wonderful. I got breath, I got life. A beautiful day out here. You got baseball swinging, basketballs basking, and it's a beautiful day out here. What about yourself, my brother Steven? How you, as they say, doing?
It's good. I just got off of. Unfortunately, the opening song is the ideal. We going through the car wash. People be happy going at the car wash. I on the other hand had a terrible day at work. So, but that is also I think to tee us up for today's and really the month's episode. It is May the 4th, and we are not talking about Star Wars. We are talking about labor. We are talking about labor today. So let's just go ahead and just jump into the news. So the first story that we have, this is a April 27th article from Capital B News. With police help, there are 41 arrests of immigrants per day in Georgia. So many of us have been subjected to, I think, of course, at one point in time, what the police might call a quote unquote routine traffic stop. Routine, and again, I can't emphasize enough the quotes on there. But to Georgia today, right, that stop can happen, I think, for a good minute, right? Land highways, that's at the airport, right? But highways, that's at the airport, right? But the bigger story here is local policing, right? The bigger story here is local policing, right? The Marietta Police Department just became the largest metro force in Georgia to sign up for ICE's 287G program. That means that local officers can check immigration status and make arrests for federal violations, and ICE pays their overtime. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security has spent nearly $200 million buying warehouses in places. Homeland Security has spent nearly $200 million buying warehouses in places like Social Circle and Oakwood, Georgia, converting them into detention centers. Social Circle's facility alone will hold 10,000 people. That's larger than many Georgia towns. So here's where it gets complicated and troubling, right? Local officials tried to fight the warehouse purchase, but their main objection was water and sewer capacity, not human rights. No, not the dignity of people. No, just infrastructure. And the deal closed anyway. So now, what we're seeing here is we're really kind of seeing an expansion here of the local and the federal, the collaboration between local municipality, law enforcement agencies, and federal agencies such as ICE, in a way that kind of really mirrors the, like the 90s and the early 2000s, where we see like this explosion of the private prison industry, and we see, and you end up having like a lot of these little small towns, a lot of these rural small towns who end up just being, their entire economy is oriented around these prisons, right? Which puts them in a very awkward position in terms of, what is even the political economy of those towns, and who makes decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So here's what I think should worry every Georgian, right? Like, of course, not just the massive dehumanization, this process of like in the system of dehumanization that's going on, in the violation of both human and civil rights. There's also, again, there's nearly $200 million are going to convert these warehouses into jails. That's money that could have gone into schools, that could have gone into roads, that could have gone into healthcare. Instead, it's paying for detention beds. And this is really, again, we're seeing the explosion here and the expansion of not only the surveillance state, we were talking about that last week, but also just like of the legal enforcement state, right? Like they're trying to create this system where there is no, like, there's a permanent underclass of labor supply, not only between the quote unquote like the legal residents, but also of anybody who then occupies or straddles that line in terms of like legal citizens of their legal status, and really just beating down on people's ability to organize and advocate and account for themselves. So I'm gonna pass it to my good brother to take on the next news segment.
Yeah, and I would say that Social Circle Georgia, I've been there a couple of times, and in my life, it's next to Hartley Creek, one of the great Georgia state parks, and you can really see a small town that's perfect for this, right? Very underdeveloped, not a lot of infrastructure to begin with, so definitely can see how these small cities all across Georgia, and Social Circle is one of the more well-to-do ones than the other ones, so you're definitely going to see that a lot more, as we already seen. And so for many of you listening, you've already heard this news because you got the email, call, text, whatever, maybe carrier pigeon about Sprint Airlines being done. Effective immediately, all operations have been shut down. The airline that we all used because they were the cheapest airline is no longer of existence. So how did we get here? For a very long time, Spirit has been having financial troubles. Starting, and you can go back a couple years ago where they unsuccessfully, which was struck down by the Biden administration, merged with JetBlue. And so earlier this year, they tried to get a $500 million federal bailout from the Trump administration. Given the surging fuel costs because of the Iran war. But here was something very interesting. The Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy puts back hard. He said Spirit was in dire straits long enough before the Iran war, pointing to 2 bankruptcies since 2024 and over $2.5 billion in losses since 2020. By last year, Spirit has already cut around 4,000 jobs, around 200 routes. They ended 2025 with only 7,500 employees, including 2,000 pilots, 3,000 flight attendants. That's a skeleton crew for an airline that once seemed everywhere. The final flight landed overnight at DFW. Air controller said it was a pleasure working with y'all. The pilot said thank you very much, but it was very quiet in of a era. And so I think that when you see things like this with something about business like Spirit, I think you have to ask the question of why did they go out of business, right? What was the reasons for why? And what does it speak to the present economic conditions of the nation? An airline that fundamentally allowed people who didn't have that much money to go from one side of the nation to the other, to everywhere in between, speaks to the growing removal of options for people, working class people like you and me. Some of us are not Delta, may only fly Delta, but we don't have only fly Delta money, which is one of the airlines that's going to take control of the lost market share of Spirit. And also looking at it from the Trump administration, the $500 million was not a charity, right? It was a last day effort as a take ourselves company. And as well as I think it really kind of shows you the relationship between private companies, especially the airline companies, and the federal government, in which it seems the way it sounds like it is called up the White House on that day, can get some money, as if it was so often that they were able to get these financial gains through the federal government. And something I think my brother Stephen was talking about before we had the meeting was that there was talks of the government wanting to take control of the planes that Spirit had, so they can replace the ones they had lost in the war against Iran. That's very strange. They've been saying that they haven't lost anything, right? The losses have been very minimal. So why do they need all these new planes? What's the proposal? I think that's something as well. Now, brother Stephen, do you have anything to add to this? Did you book with Spirit? Hopefully.
I was just gonna say I'm gonna miss Spirit. RIP. Is definitely a shame for everybody who lost their job, and yeah, no, it's kind of hard to predict the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, but and if you plan on flying, I do not envy you.
Yes. So yeah, I hope. Like I said, I think that this is a growing concern that we see in a variety of sectors. The lowest, cheapest option is being removed. So, I guess they want everyone to pay, and I guess 7 for just around those Delta tickets are nowadays. And to take you outside of the nation, let's go to the proud nation of Cuba. The Trump administration signs escalating signs of new sanctions on Cuba. The U.S. is continuing its starvation campaign of the Cuban island, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. On Friday, as millions of Cubans marched for May Day against the U.S.-led blockade, President Trump signed an executive order marking one of the most sweeping expansions of U.S. economic pressures on Cuba in decades. The executive order has sanctions that blocks all U.S. assets of foreign individuals and entities operating in Cuba, energy, defense, financial services, metals, minings, and security sectors. It also blocks all U.S. assets from financing from anyone acting on behalf of the Cuban government. And that is not even the end of it. The order also authorizes sanctions on foreign financial institutions that conduct significant transactions with the long list of Cuban entities and institutions cutting off from U.S. banking. This move will surely further the isolation Cuba has from the international financial system by limiting foreign investments on the island. In other words, it's an attempt at total economic circulation on a country that is already under a 65-year-old blockade. And this is really one of the strongest weapons of imperialism, of the Imperial United States, is the almighty dollar and its ability to simply go, yeah, this is not happening. We're going to ensure that your country will have no way of banking, no way of investment to cut them off from most of the world, because most of the world will follow these as they do not want to anger the Americans. And so really want to speak to just this growing issue regarding Cuba and its banking. Brother Stephen, you have anything to add to this before we move on?
No, I think we're good.
Well, again, I will just say one more last thing. This will, again, not break the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban people will survive. They will be prosper. This will not keep them down. And so now we're going to take a quick break for some PSAs.
Need Plan B, but I'm
Welcome back, y'all, to Rap. The voice you're hearing right now is Steven, and we're going to jump into the a little political education segment. So, we mentioned at the top of the show, this month in May, the month of May. If you've ever wondered why there's always just so much, people talking about like labor and unions in May, in the United States, there's a holiday called Labor Day. That holiday is celebrated, or at least officially, in September. But the United States, there's a few things that the that Americans have offered to the world that are positive. One of them is the struggles from the labor movement. The reason why Labor Day, everybody else, just to kind of like clarify here, right? Everybody else in the world celebrates, what we would call Labor Day in May. That's because today is the anniversary of the Haymarket Affair. That's that's a labor. That was an instance, a demonstration, then turned into perhaps something a tad more violent in 1886 in Chicago. The reason why we don't celebrate Labor Day here officially in the government is because the United States does not want us, does not want you, does not want me to know about this history at all, right? They don't actually want to know that a big part of the early labor movements, came out of and developed out of the United States. The reason why the Haymarket Affair is a big reason, actually it's the reason why, that's the whole thing with the 8-hour workday. Now, some people may have a lot of complicated thoughts and feelings about the 8-hour workday, but before, it was really bad. So, we always celebrate and acknowledge forward progress in that front. Now, to move on, we wanted to do a segment on class warfare, the literal kind. the kind author Augustus Wood writes about in his book Class Warfare in Black Atlanta. Last year, our own comrade and show co-host Dartricia sat down with Augustus Wood for a conversation about the book at Karis Books. That was last May 28th of last year. And we played a slightly shortened version, it's a little bit over an hour, of the entire interview last year on the June 9th episode of Rap. As always, you can find these previously aired shows in our show archive on www.wrfg/rap. Now I'm just going to read a little bit about the book, again, Class Warfare. So, tracing the history of post-civil rights Black Atlanta through rigorous class analysis, Augustus Wood, Atlanta native, argues that Black and white elites responded to an energized and politicized Black working class by forging a public-private partnership power block that included the small but growing Black political leadership, expanding the racial class contradictions in Black Atlanta. It's a really good, it is a really good book, a lot of good information, a lot of good history in there. And of course, it's talking about the Atlanta way. So, our good sister Dartricia did a beautiful job pulling the analysis out of him. We're going to spend the next 20 or so odd minutes walking through a little bit through what they talked about. We have a few clips that we're going to play in their own words where possible, and tying it back to kind of like where we are right now, nearly a year later. So one of the first things, we're actually going to start at the end. This is the first thing Dartricia asked was to read from the epilogue of the book. That epilogue is called The Black Worker, What Is to Be Done? Yes, that's a one we always love, the Atlanta references. And it opens with a quote from revolutionary scholar activist named Hal Barron. Let's play the clip.
Too quickly without contesting the terrain at every point. Too little attention was paid to developing limited offensives. For only in offensives can you raise new questions. In the midst of defending political and economic terrain that was important, the old left lost the capacity to project a vision of a viable alternative society. The only alternatives they put forth were cast in terms of the 30s and the Great Depression, revive the New Deal coalition. Are we menaced by a real fascist threat? When you take the racial realities of America into account, this situation requires a more complex analysis because the norms of bourgeois democracy have never been fully applied in the Black community. For the Black community, the major controls are still exercised through the traditional state and corporate methods, end quote. That's from Harold Hal Barron, March 5th, 1981, who was a revolutionary scholar activist in Chicago who worked with
You got like a minute, 30 seconds.
His passing. The preceding chapters of this book will indeed anger many people, primarily at the notion and ample evidence that the callous disregard for the lives of African American workers built the opulent dreams of urban fortune for many wealthy African Americans. Others may object to the contextualization of noted community and celebrity figures as antagonists of the Black masses, driven by their class interests. Make no mistake about it, individuals made decisions to assist in the destruction of Black working class Atlanta, but no specific decision over the last 60 years in Atlanta stands above the others in the system of domination. This book considers all decision makers in the destruction of Black working class Atlanta, as well as other urban centers, to be equally culpable in building and sustaining an inhumane, violent,
You got 30 seconds
bourgeois
left.
structure at the center of urbanization. In fact, class warfare in Black Atlanta reiterates Malcolm X's pointed point that Black people have often been subjected to the American dream of, quote, democracy.
That's because you've been running
Bourgeois
around.
nature, American history is often
Turn it on a
taken to
little.
emphasize the minor, temporary, and illusion reconciliations of African Americans with the state.
Y'all mics
But
are
it's
hot.
Black workers who, by their capacity,
Right. So there's a few things I want to pull out from that. Right. So Barron is again writing. He's citing that writing in 1981, looking back at the failures of the old left in the 1950s, and he says again, like, listen to this, right? One of our problems was that we moved to the defensive too quickly without contesting the terrain at every point. Too little attention was paid to developing limited offenses. For only in offenses can you raise new questions. Only in offenses can you raise new questions. That's the whole book in one sentence. So Wood's argument is that the black working class Atlantans in the 1970s went on the offense. They raised new questions, questions about who owns the city, who runs the schools, who decides where the highway goes, who decides where the trains go, who gets to live near the stadium. And the counteroffensive against them was by white capital and by a new black middle class leadership, or as we would like to call it, the black misleadership class. And that was the defining political project of the next 50 years in this city. So we call that project gentrification. You could call it part, that overall project, gentrification. But Wood is saying that it was always class war. And it's the black workers struck first. Now, what I want to unpack here, what does it mean what does it mean when he's saying from being on the offensive, you can raise new questions? That's because when you try to go on the offense, you are looking for ways to expose the weaknesses or the vulnerabilities, to exploit like your adversary, your enemy. And if you're in a position where all you've been doing is playing on the defense, or you've kind of been playing a turtle strategy, it's from trying to find holes in the enemy's armor that you start to that you can raise new questions, or that you can learn about, how are the ways that we can actually combat this? Which means that it was from the strikes, it was from the organizing, it was from the mobilizing, it was from the workers taking it into their own hands and trying to figure out, how do we make something shake, right? It was not, we're just hiding, biding our time. It wasn't, they were trying to make, it was either, they said revolution in our lifetime, in their lifetime, right? So now I don't mean to say all of that and to, of course, try to copy or to lift, conditions of the 1970s or the 1980s or the 20th century in general, right? And just try to copy paste onto our own conditions. We of course live in a different environment, even if that environment has a lot of different similarities, or have a lot of similarities with the past. But I want to lob a question over to my good co-host. What stood out to you in that clip, and what are the thoughts and feelings that it evokes?
I think for me, I think it really kind of speaks to the power that workers had the ability to conceptualize of their own, right? Especially back during the 1970s, as you said. That doesn't really exist nowadays. Most people barely think about their coworker beyond what we get for lunch. But back in the 70s, 60s, and so forth, workers coming together under the common interest of working at the same place, living in the same community, being black, being subject to the most unimaginable forms of racism imaginable, allowed for them to do things that we in 2026 Atlanta never even dream. I mean, we can barely give people, we can barely build a sidewalk nowadays. And so that's something that struck out to me, that was there. And again, I think the another key word was gentrification. I think gentrification has been the active mode of the city, in all communities. As going through the city, living in the city, you can just see gentrification always kind of being the mode of production when it comes to the acquiring of housing, and land, and building, strip malls back in the 80s, 90s, and today probably Amazon warehouse or something like that. So I think that, like you said, it does really get to the book in one word. Only in offense can you rise new questions.
listen, scared money don't make no money. Like, and that's true. Like, it's you have to be willing to like put yourself out there to actually take a risk in order to kind of like expose or figure out sort of like where the problem space is. And I think, you know, let me just give like an example. I think of like what I would like consider the like being on the defense. Being on the defense is, oh, we just gonna vote for Biden or Kamala or Hillary or I don't know who they gonna pull out in front of us next.
Can Obama run a third term? No.
Right, can Michelle Obama run? No, like that. Like being on the defensive is like, oh no, we can't do it. We can't vote for a third party candidate because if we do, then we're just giving up our vote. But then if you ask them what they do outside of going to the voting booth every year, then it's it just kind of like makes it really does make you think. And I think for anybody who is trying to organize for social change, I think it's important that we really do like recognize that you have to have a strategy, and you have to like think about why. You have to have a strategy, and you have to think about like what are we actually like what are we actually building towards, like what are we actually trying to like get. And again, like it was in the like you want like who controls the schools, who controls the hospitals, who controls the Spirit Airlines, you know, like who controls like all this stuff. And it's not the people. It's not the people. Then you want to say something?
Yeah, and I think something popped into my head, as well as it goes to the history of black labor in this nation, right? One of the things they never really tell you in school is the many, many, many slave revolts, slaves withholding their labor. And so from time immemorial, when it comes to black workers in the United States, the struggle for dignity, for their labor has always been a key part of it. And so what you can really see is like my brother Stephen said, there is a time in which certain groups of people in the blackness leadership class and white capital and industrial and imperialism all comes to Atlanta and try to change its course. Instead of relying on your worker to give you salvation and to give you dignity, they're going to rely on Andre Dickens to give you dignity and salvation. And I'm going to be honest, I'd rather rely on my fellow worker than Mayor Andre Dickens. So that's really I wanted to add it because it popped into my mind as we talk about the history of black labor.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. So now I want to transition and we'll get this next clip queued up. So we want to talk about Wood talks about this concept of sub-proletarianization, which is proletarian, and some people are going to be mad at me for this, but, we're talking about, just think about it as, we're talking about workers, people who are working the means of production, right? Now, Wood is reviving and inverting a thesis around proletarianization or proletarians from Joe Trotter, Black Milwaukee. It's a book about industrial workers in the 1940s. So Trotter's arguing that the Great Migration, right, when all black people, not all black people, but lots of black people moved from the South up into the North, right, mostly to escape Jim Crow and for economic opportunity, right? That was actually a conscious and strategic move. They raised money, they sent telegrams, they planned around children, they built community when they arrived. So there was like some agency in it, right? Sub-proletarianization, right? Which I like to think of as the de-workification. Capital expels black workers from the central city into the surrounding suburban counties where there is no like real labor base, and then it locks them into this work that is, in Wood's words, unstable, low wage, non-union, sometimes temporary. plus a defining feature, physical and mental mutilation of the body. Can we play that next? Can we play this clip? It's again, like to me, it's the we're taking the skills out of the workers, right? Because by putting them in a position where you have like this not very for the worker, or at least in terms of like, you're working in a warehouse, you're maybe working these gig jobs, right? Either, you're working these service jobs, like it's not, and this again is not anything against any of those like particular industries or job, or like, this is not an anti-worker thing, but rather in comparison to the to the mid 20th century, the 1950s, the 1960s, I'm sure many, maybe people, maybe some of our older listeners, or even, some of our younger ones, just ask your parents or your aunties, your uncles, like, people worked in the factories, and then people learned stuff at those factories. Like, people actually, you actually had to it was not the same as, flipping a burger, right? And we love burger flippers, but again, looking at it here in the macro, you're not actually like those fast food jobs are not actually like preparing you for anything. So that's this concept of like the sub or deproletarianization, in that it's putting large segments of the labor base, of the worker base, and making them even more precarious, right? To the point where they're going to end up taking these really terrible jobs, and some of which are very counter-revolutionary. And you made the mention again about you're making these COs, right? And now we see it, the high people joining up to be ICE agents, people signing up to be all types of stuff. So people will do that when there are no other available opportunities for them, and then because of the nature of how like these companies and these firms, again, like what I mentioned earlier, if you got a town of maybe only a couple thousand people, and then some, maybe you got Walmart that comes in there, you got Amazon that comes in there, or worse, you got some large like company who's trying to build a prison there, right? Then that small town then orients itself around, and starts to revolve around this one particular company or sector, and that's how labor gets screwed. So the last clip I want to play here, before we ride out, is kind of like talking about like, you know, what were we fighting for, right? What was that? I'm gonna ask. Let's go ahead and play it.
There's, one of the big myths about Black Power is the one that it was this random thing and it was a declension of civil rights and it had no focus and no direction, because that's what they like to say about Black working class folks, that we need leadership and guidance to help us understand things, which is not true. Black Power is so strategically complex that they spent months and months debating it, because it was four separate visions of the ways in which we could achieve power for our people. And of course, the Black workers' struggle, revolutionary nationalism, which had tendencies to radical socialism and internationalism. But you also had Black capitalism, which was conservative nationalism, nationalism, entrepreneurship, those kinds of things. You had liberal pluralism. So for Black
These
persons,
clips are playing
in office,
the 1.25x.
You had cultural nationalism.
Because otherwise it was just like, because I hate
those kinds of things. And cultural nationalism is the one
an
that's
hour
all
is
around
not a
that.
long time.
But the reason the Black workers just flocked to cultural nationalism,
I didn't even realize it was sped up until you said it.
in our historical experience, and that everywhere that we
1.25
go
is
as
usually
Black working class people,
the most
we
you can get
had
away
to
with.
say these folks are not out for our best interest. We need to control the very institutions that determine how we live our lives. There's a Black public school. I want them learning Black curriculum that we have decision-making power over. We want to choose the
Got
curriculum.
2 minutes
We
left.
want Black teachers, and we want to make sure that they are teaching the curriculum that empowers and provides for pride. If there's a grocery store, we want to make sure the food is not stale. We want to make sure that our people can work there, they can shop there. You know, what's not the we want more police to come into our neighborhoods, because every time they come in, they're going to kill and maim and surveil us. So cultural nationalism is taking control of institutions, and it's a very radical idea, because it's not just to say, well, we want to have these American values to control these states and make money. No, it's about changing the literal structure of the United States to where the local workers have decision-making power over accumulation, over profit, over community building, over everything that entails this space. So the workers flock to that, especially when they come to the city of 1970, when Atlanta becomes a Black majority for the first time, and they get here and they find a giant stadium sitting right in front of their neighborhood called Fulton County Stadium. They're like, well, where we gonna live?
1
We
minute
already
left.
know this city's up to foolishness. So they already started working with the school nonviolent coordinating committee who was in town doing the Atlanta project. They said, we want some of this. And that builds to this amazing revolutionary nationalist movement that completely sieges the city. Everything's completely done apart by the labor strikes, the housing strikes, the rent strikes. And to bring it back to your final point of the question, the reason why those things matter is that when you build a community and you understand your neighborhood as a home, there are parts of that that provide this trust, that provide this vulnerability. That if I'm willing
got 30
to do the
seconds.
work it takes for liberation, whether it be small victories, like sharing electricity, I can't pay my bill, you can pay it, we're gonna share those things, or bigger victories, like actually closing down every church's
Alright,
chicken
your mics are hot.
in the city.
Right. So in that clip, right, Wood reminds us that Black Power is just not like a slogan. It was a program, right? And there were competing visions over what that program was. Because even if, you know, not everybody in the civil rights movement or Black liberation struggle, however you might refer to it, right, all agreed on the same politics or the same policies all at the same time, right? There was debate, there's disagreement, but what there was, or at least I would say to a large, to a strong degree, that's why we refer to it, right, like as a to that era as a revolutionary movement, as a period of revolutionary struggle, was that you have this upsurgence of Black nationalism, and where you have people again. We're talking about like what is Black Power? Well, he says it like multiple times. We're talking about who gets to decide, who gets to make the decisions, who gets to, if somebody wants to put a data center in your backyard, who gets to make that decision? If somebody wants to tear down a hospital, who gets to make that decision? If somebody wants to tear down a school, who gets to make that decision? The issue is that it was not, when we're talking about the working class, Black Atlantans, they were not the ones making that decision. Which is why they decided, listen, scared money does not make no money. You have to go and just take it. You have to just go and take it. So, with that, I hope everybody enjoyed, or at least, again, you can listen to the full interview. We'll leave the link to both our show and the full interview that is up on YouTube. But we hope you appreciate it and enjoyed that little that segment for today. I think we're gonna break out here for some PSAs.
The following is a public service announcement brought to you by one of
Welcome back, y'all. Welcome back. You're listening to WRFG Atlanta. This is Rap, for Revolutionary African Perspectives. This is your host, Steven, joined by my co-host, Dan.
Yeah.
Abayomi on the board. And shout out to the comrades in the room. We got Lawrence, we got ZZ, and we got Layla in the room. So now, before we ride off into the sunset, let's talk about some community events. So, join ARC Southeast for Body Yaddy Yaddy, an autonomy drag brunch on Saturday, May 16th at 11 a.m. This is a fundraiser for ARC Southeast, the largest abortion fund in the South. Please support them, y'all. For more information, you can go to their Instagram at ARC_Southeast. Live, Laugh, Love, Abortion. On Friday, May 29th, ARC Southeast will be having a stand-up comedy show. This show will feature 5 of Atlanta's top comics, lots of raffles and giveaways with tasty treats available. There's nothing funny about the state of abortion access in 2026, yet here we are. This event will be raising money to help ARC Southeast continue the work of providing Southerners who are living under abortion ban access, funding for procedure costs, and other support like travel and lodging, ensuring that people get the reproductive care that they deserve. Tickets will be one for $30, or you can buy a limited supply if you are interested of a discounted tickets at 2 for $55. For a link to buy your tickets, visit ARC_Southeast on Instagram. And lastly, join us on Sunday, May 24th from 2 to 5 p.m. at the Washington Square Park for African Liberation Day. or ALD, African Liberation Day is a product of African people's struggle for true liberation from all forms of domination through political, military, and economic means. Thus, African Liberation Day serves as a reminder and marker of our struggle against all forms of imperialism, from colonialism to neocolonialism. This year, our theme is Revolutionary Pan-Africanism, Fights in Solidarity with Oppressed Peoples Everywhere. Our struggle is one. There will be a cultural performance by Friends of the Congo celebrating African tradition and culture, and we will also get to hear a keynote address and short Q&A from our revolutionary elder, Baba Mukasa Dada, plus a chance to connect with community through an open mic segment for poetry and music, so get your pens ready. This event will be a great opportunity to delve into some political education on Africa and connect with local community organizations. Again, join us on Sunday, May 24th from 2 to 5 p.m. in Washington Square Park for African Liberation Day. And with that, that's it for today, y'all. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to RAP, or Revolutionary African Perspectives. We're your host, Steven,
I'm Dan.
with Abigail.